The aims of the Russian offensive became evident to the German commanders when at dawn on 20th of November the artillery opened fire in the Kalmyk steppe and the shock units disposed to the south of Stalingrad attacked the 4th Romanian Army on Paulus's right flank. The tank corps on the extreme left of the Soviet grouping entered the breach in the front between Lakes Tsatsa and Barmanzak, turning to the northwest, and advanced towards Kalach, where it was to link up with the tank and cavalry corps from the Don and southwestern fronts. On the afternoon of 20th of November, the Soviet units advancing from Serafimovich reached a point slightly to the north of Surovikino, threatening Paulus's lines of communication. Paulus's Sixth Army was, however, still unaware that it was threatened with encirclement. At 6 o'clock that evening, Paulus's headquarters informed Baron von Weiss, the commanding officer of Army Group B, that they were intending to continue reconnaissance activities in Stalingrad on the following day. Later that evening, Paulus received an order from von Weiss to break off offensive operations in Stalingrad. He was to concentrate tank units, infantry units, and anti-tank weapons along his left flank, disposing them in depth in order to withstand an attack from the northwest. This order, received by Paulus at 9 p.m, marked the end of the German offensive in Stalingrad. It was, however, rendered meaningless by the speed of events. On the 21st of November, the Soviet units advancing from Serafimovich and Kletskaya effected a 90-degree turn, joined together, and moved towards the Don to the north of Kalach, directly in Paulus's rear. That same day, 40 Soviet tanks appeared on the high west bank of the Don, only a few kilometers from Paulus's command post at Golubinskaya. Another group of tanks seized a bridge over the Don without firing a shot. The German defenders mistook them for a training detachment equipped with captured Soviet tanks that often used this bridge. Soviet tanks then entered Kalach itself. And so the first lines of the encirclement of the two German armies in Stalingrad, Paulus's Sixth Army and Hoth's Fourth Tank Army, were sketched in. One of Paulus's finest units, the 384th Infantry Division, was disposed to the northwest to defend Paulus's rear. Meanwhile, Yeremenko's forces were advancing from the south. They had crushed the 29th German Motorized Division, smashed the 6th Romanian Army Corps, and were now advancing between the Chervlenaya and Donskaya Tsaritsa rivers on the Stalingrad-Kalach railway line. At dusk, Novikov's tanks reached a strongly fortified Romanian outpost. This time, Novikov did not delay. He chose not to make use of the darkness in order to concentrate his forces before attacking. At Novikov's orders, the tanks, self-propelled guns, armoured transports and troop carriers all simultaneously switched on their headlights. Hundreds of dazzling lights tore through the darkness. A vast mass of vehicles appeared out of the steppes, deafening the Romanian defences with the rumble of engines, the chatter of machine gun fire, and the roar of guns, blinding them with stabbing light, paralysing them with panic. After a few brief skirmishes, the tanks continued their advance. On the morning of the 22nd of November, they reached Buzenikovna. That same evening, east of Kalach, in the rear of the two German armies, the vanguard linked up with the tanks that had broken through from the north. By the 23rd of November, Soviet infantry units had taken up position on the rivers Shir and Aksay, securing the flanks of the shock units. The objective defined by the Supreme Command had been attained. The German armies had been encircled within 100 hours. What then determined the final outcome of these manoeuvres? What human will became the instrument of destiny? At 6 p.m. on the 22nd of November, Paulus radioed the following message to the headquarters of Army Group B. The army has been encircled. Despite heroic resistance, the whole Tsaritsa Valley, the railway line from Sovietskaya to Kalach, the bridge across the Don, and the high ground on the West Bank are now in Russian hands. The ammunition situation is acute. We have 6 days' rations. I request a free hand in case we should fail to establish a perimeter defence. The situation may compel me to abandon Stalingrad itself, together with the northern sector of the front. On the night of the 22nd-23rd of November, Paulus received orders from Hitler to name the zone occupied by his troops Fortress Stalingrad. The preceding order had read, "The army commander will transfer his headquarters to Stalingrad itself. The Sixth Army will establish a perimeter defence and await further orders." After a conference between Paulus and his corps commanders, Baron von Weiss telegraphed the Supreme Command, "In spite of the terrible weight of responsibility I feel in taking this decision, I have to inform you that I fully support General Paulus's request to withdraw the Sixth Army." General Zeitzler, the chief of the General Staff of the German land forces, who had been in constant liaison with von Weiss, fully shared the views of Paulus and von Weiss. He considered it quite impossible to supply such vast numbers of troops by air. At 2 a.m. on the 24th of November, Zeitzler informed von Weiss that he had finally succeeded in persuading Hitler to abandon Stalingrad. The order for the Sixth Army to break out would be given by Hitler later that morning. The only telephone link between Army Group B and the Sixth Army was cut soon after 10 a.m. They were expecting to receive Hitler's order to withdraw at any minute. As it was essential to act quickly, von Weiss decided to take the responsibility upon himself. As the radio message was being prepared, the director of the signal centre heard the following message addressed to Paulus by the Führer himself. "The Sixth Army has been temporarily encircled by Russian troops. I have decided to concentrate the army in the following zone: North Stalingrad, Kotluban, Heights 137 and 135, Marinovka, Tsibenko, South Stalingrad. The army can be assured that I shall do everything in my power both to keep it supplied and to break the encirclement. I know the bravery of the Sixth Army and its commanding officer, and I am confident that it will do its duty." The will of Hitler was the instrument of destiny for both Paulus's army and the Third Reich itself. At his command, a new page of German military history was written by Paulus, von Weiss, and Zeitzler, by the commanding officers of corps and battalions, by the German soldiers themselves, by all those who, albeit reluctantly, executed his orders. After 100 hours of combat, units from the southwestern front, the Don front, and the Stalingrad front had linked up. The Soviet tanks met under a dark winter sky on the outskirts of Kalach. The snow-covered steppes were scorched by shell bursts and ploughed up by the treads of hundreds of vehicles. The heavy machines tore on through clouds of snow, sending up a white veil into the air. Where they turned particularly sharply, the veil was dotted with fragments of frozen dirt. The fighters and ground support aircraft from the other side of the Volga flew low over the steppe. You could hear the thunder of heavy artillery from the northeast. The dark, cloudy sky was lit by flashes of dim lightning. 2 T-34s stopped next to one another beside a small wooden house. Excited by their success and the nearness of death, the dirty soldiers greedily gulped in the frosty air. After the stench of oil and fumes in their tanks, this was a great joy. Pushing back their black leather helmets, they entered the house. The commander of the tank had come from Lake Tsatsar, took half a litre of bottle of vodka out of his pocket. A woman in huge felt boots and a padded jacket put some glasses on the table. Her hands were trembling. "Oi, oi, we never thought we'd come out alive," she sobbed. "How the guns fired and fired! I spent 2 days and 1 night in the cellar." 2 more soldiers came into the room. They were squat and broad-shouldered, like peg-tops. "Valera, see what they brought! Well, I think we've got something to go with it," said the commander of the tank that had come from the north. Valera plunged his hand into a deep pocket in his overalls and pulled out a piece of smoked sausage wrapped up in a dirty page from an army newspaper. He began to divide it up, carefully picking up the pieces of white fat that fell out and pressing them back into place with his dirty fingers. The soldiers happily began drinking. One of them, his mouth full of sausage, smiled and said, "Your vodka and our sausage, we've linked up." This joke went down well. Full of warmth and comradeliness, the soldiers repeated it to one another and laughed. The commander of the tank from the south reported by radio to his squadron commander that the link-up had been effected near Kalach. He added that the crew of the other tank were splendid fellows and that they'd drunk a bottle of vodka together. This report was rapidly passed back. 3 minutes later, Karpov repeated it to Novikov. Novikov could sense the love and admiration that now surrounded him at headquarters. They had carried out their task according to schedule, and they had sustained almost no casualties. After reporting to Yeremenko, Neudobnov gave Novikov a long squeeze of the hand. His usually bilious and irritable eyes looked bright and gentle. "You see what miracles our lads can accomplish when we've eliminated the hidden enemies and saboteurs," he said. Getmanov embraced Novikov. He looked round at all the officers, orderlies, drivers, radio operators and cipher clerks, gave a sob and said in a loud voice, "Thank you, Pyotr Pavlovich. A Russian thank you, a Soviet thank you. I thank you as a communist. I take off my hat to you." Once again he embraced and kissed a deeply moved Novikov. "You prepared everything, you foresaw everything, you studied your men, and this is the fruit of your labour." Novikov felt both overjoyed and embarrassed. He waved a file of reports at Getmanov. "I'll tell you what I foresaw. The man I counted on was Makarov, but Makarov dawdled, deviated from his assigned route, wasted an hour and a half in an unnecessary skirmish on his flank. As for Bailov, I was quite certain that he had just forged straight ahead without paying the least attention to his flanks and rear. And what did he do? On the second day, instead of outflanking a centre of enemy resistance, he got bogged down in an operation he undertook against some artillery and infantry units, and even went over to the defensive. He wasted 11 hours. It was Karpov who was the first to arrive in Kalach. He went flat out. He didn't once look back. He didn't give a damn what was happening on his flanks. He was the one who broke through the Germans' lines of communication. So much for my study of men. So much for what I foresaw. I thought he'd be so busy securing his flanks that I'd have to drive him on with a cudgel." Getmanov smiled. All right, we all know the value of modesty. That's something Stalin's taught us." Novikov was happy. He thought he really must love Yevgenia Nikolaevna if he thought of her so much on a day like this. He kept looking round as if she might appear any moment. "And what I'll never forget, Pyotr Pavlovich," Getmanov went on, his voice lowered to a whisper, "is the way you hung fire for 8 minutes at the beginning. The army commander was waiting. Yeremenko was waiting. I've heard that Stalin himself phoned to ask why the tanks hadn't gone in yet. You made Stalin wait. And then you breached the enemy front without losing one tank, without losing one man. That's something I'll never forget." That night, when Novikov was in his tank on the way to Kalach, Getmanov called to see Neudobnov. "Comrade General, I've written a letter about the way the Corps commander delayed for 8 minutes at the start of the crucial operation. The operation to decide the outcome of the great patriotic war. I'd like you to take a look at this document." Stalin's secretary, Poskrevyshev, was present when Vasilevsky reported by radio that the encirclement of the German armies had been completed. For a few moments Stalin just sat there, his eyes half closed, as though he were going to sleep. Poskrebyshchev held his breath and tried not to move. This was his hour of triumph. He had not only defeated his current enemy, he had defeated the past. In the village, the grass would grow thicker over the tombs of 1930. The snow and ice of the Arctic Circle would remain dumb and silent. He knew better than anyone that no one condemns a victor. He wished he had his children beside him. He wished he could see his little granddaughter, the daughter of the wretched Yakov. He would have just stroked her quietly on the head, not so much as glancing at the world that stretched out beyond the threshold of the hut. His beloved daughter. His quiet, sickly granddaughter. Memories of childhood, the cool of a garden, the distant sound of a river. What did anything else matter? His strength existed independently of the Soviet state, independently of his great divisions. Very slowly and gently, his eyes still closed, he repeated the words of a song. "You're caught in the net, my pretty little bird. I won't let you go for anything in the world." Poskrebyshchev looked at Stalin, at his grey, thinning hair, his pockmarked face, his closed eyes. Suddenly he felt the ends of his fingers grow cold. The success of the Stalingrad offensive filled in a number of gaps in the Soviet line of defence. Between the Stalingrad front and the Don front, between Chuikov's army and the divisions disposed to the north of it, between the companies and platoons ensconced in the buildings of Stalingrad and the forces in the rear from which they had been cut off. At the same time, this success altered people's consciousness. A feeling of being cut off, of being wholly or partially surrounded, was replaced by a feeling of wholeness, of unity. It is precisely this sense of fusion between the individual and the mass which engenders the morale that leads to victory. The exact opposite, of course, took place in the hearts and minds of the encircled German soldiers. A huge piece of flesh, composed of hundreds of thousands of sensitive, intelligent cells that had been torn from the main body of the German armed forces. Tolstoy claimed that it was impossible fully to encircle an army. This claim was borne out by the experience of his time. The years 1941 to 1945 prove that it is indeed possible to encircle an entire army, to nail it to the ground, to fetter it in a hoop of iron. A large number of armies, Soviet and German alike, were encircled during these years. Tolstoy's claim was indisputably true at his time, but like most of the thoughts of great men about wars and politics, it was by no means an eternal truth. What made encirclements possible was the combination of the extraordinary mobility of shock troops and the vast, unwieldy rears on which they depended. The encircling forces have all the advantages of mobility on their side. The encircled forces entirely lose this mobility. It's impossible for an encircled army to organize its vast, complex, and factory-like rear. The encircled forces are paralyzed. The encircling forces have motors and wings. An encircled army loses more than just mobility and technical resources. Its soldiers and officers are somehow excluded from the contemporary world, thrust back into the past. They begin to reappraise not only the strength of the enemy and the likely development of the war, they also begin to reappraise the politics of their own country, the appeal of their political leaders, their laws and constitution, their characteristics as a nation, their past and their future. The encircling forces go through a similar reappraisal, but inversely. The victory of Stalingrad determined the outcome of the war. But the silent quarrel between the victorious people and the victorious state was not yet over. On the outcome of this quarrel depended the destiny, the freedom of man. A gentle drizzle was falling in the forest of Görlitz. on the frontier between eastern Prussia and Lithuania. A man of average height, wearing a grey raincoat, was walking down a path between the tall trees. As the sentries caught sight of him, they held their breath, freezing into perfect immobility, allowing the raindrops to run down their cheeks. Hitler had wanted to be alone for a moment, to have a breath of fresh air. The fine, gentle drizzle was very pleasant. He loved the silent trees, and he enjoyed walking over the soft carpet of fallen leaves. All day he had found the staff of his field headquarters quite unbearable. He had never felt any respect for Stalin. His actions before the war had always seemed crude and stupid. There was a peasant simplicity even in his cunning and treachery. His Soviet state was absurd. One day Churchill would understand the tragic role played by the Reich. With its own body it had defended Europe from Stalin's Asiatic Bolshevism. He thought of the men on his staff who had insisted on the withdrawal of the Sixth Army from Stalingrad. They would now be particularly reserved and respectful. He was equally irritated by those whose faith in him was unconditional. They would use eloquent words to assure him of their fidelity. He kept trying to think scornfully of Stalin. He wanted somehow to despise him, and he knew this was because he no longer had a sense of his own superiority over him. That cruel, vengeful little shopkeeper from the Caucasus. Anyway, this one success of his changed very little. Had he sensed a veiled mockery today in the eyes of that old gelding Zeitzler? He was annoyed at the thought that Goebbels would probably report the witticisms of the English Prime Minister about his gifts as a military leader. "You've got to admit it. He is quite witty," Goebbels would laugh. At the bottom of his intelligent, handsome eyes, he had glimpsed the envious light of a triumphant rival, something he had thought extinguished forever. This trouble over the Sixth Army somehow prevented him from feeling fully himself. What mattered was not the loss of Stalingrad or the encirclement of the army. What mattered was that Stalin had gained the upper hand. Well, he'd soon see to that. Hitler had always had ordinary thoughts and ordinary endearing weaknesses. But while he had seemed great and omnipotent, they had evoked only love and admiration. He had embodied the national élan of the German people. But if the power of the armed forces and the Reich wavered for even a moment, then his wisdom began to seem tarnished. His genius vanished. He had never envied Napoleon. He couldn't bear people whose greatness endured even in solitude, poverty, and impotence, people who were able to remain strong even in a dark cellar or attic. He had found it impossible, during this solitary walk in the forest, to rise above everyday trivia and find the true, just solution that was just beyond the plodders of the general staff and his party leadership. He found it unbearably depressing to be reduced again to the level of ordinary men. It had been beyond the capacities of a mere man to found the new Germany, to kindle the war and the ovens of Auschwitz, to create the Gestapo. To be the founder of the new Germany and its Führer, one had to be a superman. His thoughts and feelings, his everyday life, had to exist outside and above those of ordinary men. The Russian tanks had brought him back to his starting point. His thoughts and passions were no longer directed towards God and the destiny of the world. The Russian tanks had brought him back among men. At first he had found it soothing to be alone in the forest, but now he began to feel frightened. Without his bodyguards and aides, he felt like a little boy in a fairy tale, lost in a dark, enchanted forest. Yes, he was like Tom Thumb. He was like the goat who had wandered into the forest, unaware that the wolf had stolen up on him through a thicket. His childhood fears had re-emerged through the thick darkness of decades. He could see the picture in his old book of fairy tales, a goat in the middle of a glade. and between the damp, dark trees the red eyes and white teeth of the wolf. He wanted to scream, to call for his mother, to close his eyes, to run. This forest, however, he had only the regiment of his personal guard, thousands of strong, highly trained men whose reflexes were instantaneous. Their sole aim in life was to stop the last breath disturbing a single hair on his head. The telephones buzzed discreetly, passing on from zone to zone, from sector to sector, each movement of the Führer who decided to go for a walk on his own in the woods. He turned round, restraining his desire to run. He began to walk back towards the dark green buildings of his field headquarters. The guards noticed he was hurrying and thought he must have urgent matters to attend to. How could they have imagined that the gathering twilight had reminded the Führer of a wolf in a fairy tale? Through the trees he could see the lights of the buildings. For the first time he felt a sense of horror, human horror, at the thought of the crematoria in the camps. The men in the bunkers and command posts of the 62nd Army felt very strange indeed. They wanted to touch their faces, feel their clothes, wiggle their toes in their boots. The Germans weren't shooting. It was quiet. The silence made their heads whirl. They felt as though they'd grown empty, as though their hearts had gone numb, as though their arms and legs moved in a different way from usual. It felt very odd, even inconceivable, to eat kasha in silence, to write a letter in silence, to wake up at night and hear silence. This silence then gave birth to many different sounds that seemed new and strange. The clink of a knife, the rustle of a page being turned in a book, the creak of a floorboard, the sound of bare feet, the scratching of a pen, the click of a safety catch on a pistol, the ticking of the clock on the wall of the bunker. Krylov, the chief of staff, entered Chuikov's bunker. Chuikov himself was sitting on a bed, and Gurov was sitting opposite him at the table. He had hurried in to tell them the latest news. The Stalingrad front had gone over to the offensive, and it would be only a matter of hours before Paulus was surrounded. Instead, he looked at Chuikov and Gurov, and then sat down without saying a word. What he had seen on his comrades' faces must have been very special. His news was far from unimportant. The three men sat there in silence. The silence had already given birth to sounds that had seemed erased forever. Soon it would give birth to new thoughts, new anxieties and passions that had been uncalled for during the fighting itself. But they were not yet aware of these new thoughts. Their anxieties, ambitions, resentments and jealousies had yet to emerge from under the crushing weight of the fighting. They were still unaware that their names would be forever linked with a glorious page of Russian military history. These minutes of silence were the finest of their lives. During these minutes they felt only human feelings. None of them could understand afterwards why it was they had known such happiness and such sorrow, such love and such humility. Is there any need to continue the story? Is there any need to describe the pitiful spectacle many of these generals then made of themselves? Constant drunkenness, the bitter disputes over the sharing out of the glory, how a drunken Chuikov leapt on Rodimtsev and tried to strangle him at a victory celebration merely because Nikita Khrushchev had thrown his arms around Rodimtsev and kissed him without so much as a glance at Chuikov. Is there any need to say that Chuikov and his staff first left the right bank in order to attend the celebrations of the 25th anniversary of the Cheka, and that the following morning, blind drunk, he and his comrades had nearly drowned in the Volga and had to be fished out by soldiers from a hole in the ice? Is there any need to describe the subsequent curses, reproaches and suspicions? There's only one truth. There cannot be two truths. It's hard to live with no truth, with scraps of truth, with a half-truth. A partial truth is no truth at all. Let the wonderful silence of this night be the truth, the whole truth. Let us remember the good in these men. Let us remember their great achievements. Chirikov left the bunker and climbed slowly up to the top of the slope. The wooden steps creaked under his boots. It was dark. Both the east and the west were quiet. The silhouettes of factories, the ruined buildings, the trenches and dugouts all merged into the calm, silent darkness of the earth, the sky, and the Volga. This was the true expression of the people's victory. Not the ceremonial marches and orchestras, not the fireworks and artillery salutes, but this quietness, the quietness of a damp night in the country. Chirikov was very moved. He could hear his heart thumping in his breast. Then he realized the silence was not total. From Bani Ovrag and the Red October factory came the sound of men singing. Below, on the banks of the Volga, he could hear quiet voices and the sound of a guitar. He went back to the bunker. Gurov was waiting for him so they could have supper. "What silence, Nikolai Ivanovitch," said Gurov. "I can't believe it." Chirikov sniffed and didn't answer. They sat down at table. And Gurov said, "Well, comrade, you must have had a hard time if a happy song makes you cry." Chirikov looked at him in astonishment. In a dugout on the slope leading down to the Volga, a few soldiers were sitting around a table fashioned from a few planks. The sergeant major was pouring out mugs of vodka by the light of an oil lamp. The soldiers watched as the precious liquid slowly mounted to the level indicated by his horny fingernail. They drank and then reached out for some bread. One of the soldiers finished chewing on his piece of bread and said, "Yes, he gave us a hard time, but we were too much for him in the end. He's certainly quietened down now. You can't hear a sound." "He's had enough. The epic of Stalingrad is over. He's done a lot of damage, though. He set half of Russia on fire." They chewed their bread very slowly. It was as though they were breaking off for a meal after a long and difficult job of work. Their heads grew hazy, but somehow this haziness left them clear-headed. The taste of bread, the crunch of onion, the weapons piled beside the mud wall, the Volga, this victory over a powerful enemy, a victory won by the same hands that had stroked the hair of their children, fondled their women, broken bread, and rolled tobacco in scraps of newspaper. They experienced all this with extraordinary clarity. The Muscovites, who were now preparing to return home, were probably rejoicing more at the thought of escaping their life as evacuees than at the thought of seeing Moscow again. Everything in Sverdlovsk, Omsk, Tashkent, and Krasnoyarsk had become unbearable. The streets, the hand houses, the stars in the autumn sky, even the taste of bread. If there was a hopeful Soviet Information Bureau bulletin, they said, well, it won't be much longer now. If the news was bad, they said, oh, that means they'll interrupt the re-evacuation of families. Countless stories sprang up about people who had managed to get back to Moscow without a pass. You had to change trains several times, using local and suburban trains where there were no inspectors. People had forgotten that only a year before, in October 1941, every extra day spent in Moscow had seemed a torment. How enviously they had looked at their fellow citizens who were about to exchange the dangerous skies of their birthplace for the peace and safety of Tartary and Uzbekistan. They had forgotten how some of the men and women, not included on the lists of evacuees, had abandoned their bundles and suitcases and walked to Zagorsk on foot, anything to get out of Moscow. Now people were ready to abandon their work and belongings, abandon their ordered lives, and walk back to Moscow. In the second half of November, the Soviet Information Bureau announced first that a blow had been struck against the German fascist forces in the region of Vladikavkaz, and then that a successful offensive had been launched in the Stalingrad area. There were 9 announcements in the course of 2 weeks. The offensive continues. A new blow struck against the enemy. Our forces near Stalingrad, overcoming enemy resistance, have broken through his new line of defence on the east bank of the Don. Our forces, continuing their offensive, have advanced another 20 kilometres. Our troops in the central Don region have now taken the offensive against the German fascist forces. The offensive launched by our forces in the central Don region continues. The offensive launched by our forces in the northern Caucasus. A new blow struck by our forces to the southwest of Stalingrad. The offensive launched by our forces to the south of Stalingrad. On New Year's Eve, the Soviet Information Bureau published a report entitled A Summary of the Past 6 Weeks of the Stalingrad Offensive. This finally announced the encirclement of the German armies in Stalingrad. A change in popular consciousness was about to become manifest. The first stirrings of this had taken place subconsciously, as secretly as the preparations for the offensive itself. For all the apparent similarities, this change in consciousness was to prove very different indeed from that which had followed the earlier victories near Moscow. The Moscow victory had served chiefly to change people's attitude towards the Germans. After December 1941, the mystical fear aroused by the German army disappeared. The Stalingrad victory, on the other hand, served mainly to change people's attitudes towards themselves, to develop a new form of self-consciousness in the army and in the population as a whole. Soviet Russians began to think of themselves differently, to adopt a different manner towards other nationalities. The history of Russia was no longer the history of sufferings and humiliations undergone by the workers and peasantry. It was the history of Russian national glory. People's way of thinking at the time of the Moscow victory was still fundamentally the same as it had been before the war. The reinterpretation of the events of the war, the new consciousness of the power of the Russian armed forces, of the power of the Russian state, was part of a long and complex process. This process had begun long before the war, but only on an unconscious level. The three major events formed the basis for this new vision of human relationships and life itself: collectivization, industrialization, and the year 1937. These events, like the October Revolution itself, involved the displacement of vast sections of the population, displacements accompanied by the physical extermination of numbers of people far greater than had accompanied the liquidation of the Russian aristocracy and the industrial and commercial bourgeoisie. These events, presided over by Stalin himself, marked the economic triumph of the builders of the new Soviet state, the builders of socialism in one country. At the same time, these events were the logical result of the October Revolution itself. This new social order, this order which had triumphed during the period of collectivization, industrialization, and the year 1937, with its almost complete change of leading cadres, had preferred not to renounce the old ideological concepts and formulae. The fundamental characteristic of the new order was state nationalism, but it still made use of a phraseology that went back to the beginning of the 20th century and the formation of the Bolshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party. The war accelerated a previously unconscious process, allowing the birth of an overtly national consciousness. The word Russian once again had meaning. To begin with, during the retreat, the connotations of this word were mainly negative: the hopelessness of Russian roads, Russian backwardness, Russian confusion, Russian fatalism. But a national self-consciousness had been born. It was waiting only for a military victory. National consciousness is a powerful and splendid force at a time of disaster. It is splendid not because it is nationalist, but because it is human. It is a manifestation of human dignity, human love of freedom, human faith in what is good. But this consciousness can develop in a variety of ways. No one can deny that the head of a personnel department, protecting his institute from cosmopolitans and bourgeois nationalists, is expressing his national consciousness in a different manner to a Red Army soldier defending Stalingrad. This awakening of national consciousness can be related to the tasks facing the state during the war and the years after the war. The struggle for national sovereignty and the affirmation of what is truly Russian, truly Soviet in every area of life. These tasks, however, were not suddenly imposed on the state. They appeared when the events in the countryside, the creation of a national heavy industry, and the complete change in the ruling cadres marked the triumph of a social order defined by Stalin as socialism in one country. The birthmarks of Russian social democracy were finally erased. And this process finally became manifest at a time when Stalingrad was the only beacon of freedom in the kingdom of darkness. A people's war reached its greatest pathos at the time of the defense of Stalingrad. The logic of events was such that Stalin chose this moment to proclaim openly his ideology of state nationalism.